2nd, 1979, a Tuesday. In the city of Sverdlovsk, now known as Yekaterinburg, the sun was setting behind the gray, brutalist skyline. Most citizens were heading home to their families, unaware that they were living in the shadow of one of the most dangerous secrets in the Soviet Union. Just a few kilometers from the city center sat Military Compound 19. To the neighbors, it was just another drab, high-walled industrial site. But inside, it was a factory for the end of the world. This was the heart of the Soviet biological weapons program. Behind reinforced concrete and steel, scientists were perfecting a weaponized version of Bacillus anthracis, Anthrax. And on this specific Tuesday, a single tiny human error was about to open the gates of a silent hell. Inside Sector 6 of Compound 19, the air was thick with the smell of industrial chemicals and stale coffee. The drying room was the final stage of production. Here, the anthrax was turned from a liquid slurry into a fine, concentrated powder, so light it could float on a breeze, yet so deadly that a microscopic amount in the lungs was a death sentence. To prevent these spores from escaping, the facility used a sophisticated exhaust system fitted with heavy-duty ceramic filters. These filters were the only thing standing between the labs and the 2 million people living in Sverdlovsk. They were inspected every shift. It was a routine, boring job, and in the Soviet system, routine was often the father of tragedy. At roughly 4 p.m., a technician, whose name has been debated for decades, noticed a pressure drop in one of the exhaust pipes. He climbed the ladder, unbolted the heavy metal casing, and found the filter clogged with dust and chemical residue. He removed it, intending to replace it immediately. But as he climbed down, he was distracted. Perhaps it was a colleague calling him to tea. Perhaps he was simply exhausted by the crushing weight of Soviet quotas. He placed the dirty filter on the floor and scribbled a note on a small scrap of paper. Filter removed. Pipe is open. Do not turn on the machines. He left the note on the supervisor's desk, expecting the evening shift to handle the replacement. He didn't sign the logbook. He didn't wait for a verbal handoff. He just clocked out. The supervisor for the evening shift was a man named Nikolai Chernyakov. He arrived late, rushed by the chaos of a shifting schedule. He saw the note on his desk, but in the dim light of the office, his mind didn't register the urgency. Or perhaps, as some reports suggest, he mistook the note for an old maintenance request. He crumpled the paper and tossed it into the trash. In the official Soviet record, everything was fine. No repairs were pending. No hazards were flagged. Chernyakov gave the order to resume production. At 8 p.m., the massive drying machines in Sector 6 were powered on. The turbines began to hum, creating a powerful vacuum that sucked the air from the lab and pushed it out through the exhaust pipes. Only this time, there was no ceramic barrier. There was only an open hole. For the next 3 hours, a concentrated plume of anthrax spores was pumped directly into the cool night air of Sverdlovsk. Because it was night, the air was heavy and still, allowing the invisible cloud to stay low to the ground. It didn't dissipate, it crawled. Carried by a gentle northwesterly wind, the cloud drifted toward the Chkalovsky district, a neighborhood of factories, worker dormitories, and schools. Thousands of people were sleeping, breathing in the spores with every breath. Anthrax spores are odorless, colorless, and tasteless. You wouldn't know you had inhaled them until it was too late. By the time the mistake was discovered by a technician at midnight, the cloud had already traveled 4 kilometers. When the night shift technician finally realized the filter was missing, he panicked. He shut down the machines immediately, his heart hammering against his ribs. He knew what he had done. He knew what Sector 6 produced. He reported the incident to his superiors, expecting an immediate citywide evacuation. But the response from the Kremlin wasn't an alarm. It was a command for total silence. The missing filter was replaced in minutes. The logbooks were altered. The technician was told that nothing had happened. But as the sun rose on April 3rd, the invisible fire was already burning in the lungs of hundreds. And the Soviet state was already preparing its first and most enduring lie. For the first 3 days after the filter was forgotten, Sverdlovsk was quiet. The anthrax spores were microscopic, settled deep within the alveolar sacs of those who had breathed the night air. There was no pain, no warning, but inside the bodies of the workers in the Chkalovsky district, a biological clock had begun to tick. The spores were being transported by macrophages to the lymph nodes in the chest. There they germinated. They began to multiply, releasing a trio of deadly toxins: protective antigen, edema factor, and lethal factor. By Friday, April 6th, the first wave of the fever hit. It looked like a common spring cold, a slight shiver, a dry cough, a heavy fatigue. Men went to bed early, telling their wives they'd be fine by morning. They had no idea their internal organs were already beginning to liquefy. 1:30 to 3. The deceptive calm. What makes inhalation anthrax particularly cruel is the latent period. Many victims felt a brief flash of recovery on the second day of symptoms. The fever would break. The strength would return. Workers at the ceramics factory across from Compound 19 actually returned to their shifts, laughing about the quick flu. But this was a medical illusion. While they felt better, the toxins were causing massive internal hemorrhaging. The lymph nodes in the center of the chest, the mediastinum, were swelling to the size of fists, putting immense pressure on the heart and lungs. By the time the second wave of symptoms arrived, it wasn't a cold anymore. It was a catastrophe. The deceptive calm was over, and the final stage of the infection was about to begin, 3 to 4:30. The biological horror. The end came with a violence that horrified the local doctors. The patients would suddenly gasp for air, their faces turning a deep necrotic purple, a condition known as cyanosis. Their lungs were no longer processing oxygen. They were filling with a dark, bloody fluid. Every cough brought up a thick, a blackish red foam. This wasn't pneumonia. This was a total systemic collapse. The toxins were eating through the walls of the blood vessels, causing blood to leak into every cavity of the body. In the final hours, victims experienced the black vomit as their digestive tracts began to fail. Death usually followed within 6 to 12 hours of the second stage. It was a death by drowning, not in water, but in one's own blood. 4:30 to 6. The confusion of the wards. Hospitals in the Chkalovsky district were not prepared for a biological war. Doctors at City Hospital number 40 were seeing dozens of men in their 20s and 30s, previously healthy workers, collapsing and dying within hours of admission. When they performed initial x-rays, they saw a terrifying widening of the chest cavity, a signature of anthrax they didn't yet recognize. They tried every antibiotic in the Soviet pharmacopoeia, but nothing worked. The spores were too concentrated. As the morgues began to overflow, the confusion turned into a localized panic. The doctors begged for answers from the military authorities at Compound 19, just a few blocks away. The answer they received was a cold, bureaucratic wall of silence. No help was coming, only the liquidation teams. By the second week of April, the Chkalovsky district was under a quiet siege. Black Volga sedans, the calling card of the KGB, now sat outside every hospital and clinic. They didn't bring epidemiologists or medicine. They brought shredders. Teams of specialists in plain clothes entered medical records offices, confiscating every chart that mentioned respiratory failure or internal bleeding. The doctors were ordered to sign non-disclosure agreements under the threat of treason. The official cause of death for dozens of men was changed in a single afternoon. Pneumonia became gastric distress. The systemic collapse of the lungs was rewritten as a reaction to tainted food. The truth was being erased while the bodies were still warm, replaced by a narrative that protected the state at the cost of the survivors' sanity. On the morning of April 13th, the state-controlled press broke the silence. But they didn't mention Compound 19. Instead, they announced an outbreak of Siberian sores, the common name for cutaneous anthrax, caused by infected cattle. The story was perfect. Greedy private farmers had allegedly slaughtered sick cows and sold the meat on the black market to unsuspecting citizens. Posters appeared overnight in every shop window, warning people against unauthorized meat. It was a masterclass in gaslighting. By blaming a shipment of bad meat, the government shifted the guilt onto the victims. They were told they weren't dying because of a military failure. They were dying because of their own lack of socialist discipline. They were told they had eaten their own death. While the public was told to watch their plates, the military began the sanitization. It was a surreal, terrifying sight. Liquidators in rubberized suits and gas masks descended on the Chkalovsky district. They climbed onto the roofs of 5-story apartment blocks, hosing them down with powerful streams of chlorine and water. They scraped the top 4 inches of soil from the parks and playgrounds where children had played just days before. The goal wasn't just to kill the remaining spores. It was to literally wash the evidence into the sewers. Anyone who asked why a meat infection required hosing down the rooftops was told it was for general disinfection. The city smelled of bleach and fear, a chemical scent that masked the lingering odor of decay. The cruelty of the meat lie extended to the funerals. Families were forbidden from seeing the bodies of their loved ones. The caskets were made of heavy wood, sealed shut, and in many cases, doused in disinfectants before being lowered into the ground. The KGB attended the burials, standing at the edge of the cemeteries in their long gray coats, watching to see who asked too many questions. If a widow claimed her husband hadn't eaten meat in weeks, she was visited later that night and told that her memory was mistaken. The state wasn't just burying its victims, it was burying the very memory of how they died. By the end of April, the Chkalovsky district had become a place of whispers, where the truth was a dangerous commodity and the wind was a silent enemy. For 13 years, the families of Sverdlovsk lived with a shadow of manufactured guilt. Mothers were told their sons died because they bought tainted meat from the black market. Widows were told their husbands were victims of their own greed. The state had effectively gaslit an entire city. Compound 19 remained active, its chimneys still standing, its secrets protected by a wall of official silence that survived even the collapse of the Berlin Wall. But the truth about biological weapons is like the spores themselves. It is incredibly hard to kill. No matter how much soil you scrape or how many files you shred, the math of the outbreak never added up to a meat infection. Inhalation anthrax leaves a signature that no bureaucrat can erase. In 1992, the silence finally broke. Boris Yeltsin, the first president of the Russian Federation and the former regional Communist Party boss of Sverdlovsk during the outbreak, made a stunning admission to the world. In an interview with Komsomolskaya Pravda, he admitted that the meat lie was a cover-up. The military was to blame, he stated. He confirmed that a leak from Compound 19 had caused the deaths. It was a moment of global shock. For decades, the USSR had claimed to be in full compliance with the Biological Weapons Convention. Yeltsin's words proved that for nearly 20 years, a superpower had been mass-producing the Black Death just miles away from schools and playgrounds. Despite the confession, the full scale of the tragedy remains a mystery. The official death toll was listed as 66, but independent researchers and local survivors tell a different story. They point to the zone of silence, these entire blocks in the Chkalovsky district, where almost every household lost someone. Because the KGB confiscated the medical records, the real number could be in the hundreds, perhaps even 1,000. Anthrax spores are hardy. They can remain dormant in the soil for decades, waiting to be disturbed. Today, Compound 19 is still a restricted military site. It is a fortress of concrete and secrets, surrounded by modern apartment complexes, where children play in the same wind that once carried the invisible fire. Sverdlovsk 19 is a chilling reminder of the fragility of truth in a closed system. It shows us that the most dangerous weapon isn't a bomb or a missile, but a forgotten note on a desk, and a government that fears embarrassment more than it values life. As the sun sets over Yekaterinburg today, the Chkalovsky district looks like any other neighborhood, but the older generation still remembers the smell of bleach in the air. They remember the men in gray coats at the cemetery, and they know that somewhere, deep in the archives, there is a list of names that will never be read aloud. The filter was replaced 47 years ago, but the breath of Compound 19 still lingers in the silence of the Russian night.